Go on, Bento, take your treasure. It seems the Colonel thought your years of loyalty were worth exactly what's in this bag. Rot and rust, Donna Perpetua sneered, her voice cutting through the humid air of the parlor like a whip. The laughter that followed was high, sharp and cold, echoing off the mahogany walls of the Fazenda Santa Sofia. Bento stood there, his head bowed, his calloused hands trembling as the small, stained burlap sack hit the floor with a dull thud. To the local judge, the priest and the wealthy neighbors gathered for the reading of the will, it was a final, cruel joke from a dying man to his most faithful servant. But for Bento, the weight of that bag felt different. It felt like a heavy door finally beginning to creak open. Before we continue with this journey of secrets and justice, I want to ask you to stay with me until the very end. This isn't just a story about a bag of scraps. It's a story about a truth so powerful it could burn down an empire of lies. If you enjoy narratives that touch the soul, please leave a comment with a rating from 0 to 10 for this story. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel to support our work. Your presence here means everything to us. The air in the Paraíba Valley in the 1870s was never truly clear. It was always thick, sometimes with the sweet, cloying scent of ripening coffee beans, and other times with a grey, suffocating mist that clung to the red clay like a shroud. On this particular morning, the mist was so dense you could barely see the white colonial pillars of the big house from the slave quarters. Colonel Custodio had been buried only 2 days prior in the family chapel, and already the atmosphere of the plantation had shifted. The silence wasn't peaceful. It was a held breath, a moment of terrifying stillness before a storm. Bento was a man who knew the value of silence. For 40 years he had been the Colonel's shadow, the personal valet who saw every tear, heard every whispered bribe, and polished the boots that stepped on the necks of his brothers. His skin was a map of a lifetime spent under the scorching sun and the even harsher gaze of the masters. He wasn't broken in spirit, but his bones were weary, and his heart was a vault of secrets he had promised to take to the grave. He lived in a constant state of internal war, torn between the loyalty he felt for the man who had sometimes shown him a twisted kind of mercy, and the burning desire for a justice he thought would never come. His only reason for waking up each morning was Tiana. She was a young girl, barely on the cusp of womanhood, an orphan Bento had raised as his own daughter in the small, cramped room of the quarters. Tiana was special. She had a rare gift for embroidery, her fingers moving with a grace that seemed impossible for someone born into a life of toil. She could stitch a bird so lifelike you expected it to fly off the cloth, and she had an even rarer ability to read people. She could look at Donna Perpetua and know by the slight tightening of the widow's jaw exactly how much danger they were in. "Bento, why does the mistress look at us like we are already gone?" Tiana had asked that morning, her eyes wide with a fear she couldn't quite hide. "Hush, little bird," Bento had whispered, his heart sinking. "The mistress is just grieving. We stay quiet, we do our work, and the shadows will pass." But Bento knew he was lying. He had seen the ledgers. He had heard the frantic late-night discussions between the Colonel and his lawyers before the end. The Fazenda Santa Sofia, for all its outward grandeur, was a hollow shell. It was drowning in debt, the gold of previous decades long since spent on Parisian lace and imported carriages. And Donna Perpetua, a woman whose heart was made of flint and whose pride was her only religion, was not the type to suffer in poverty. She needed a way out, and in 1870 the quickest way to clear a debt was to sell the only property that still had value, the people. Donna Perpetua viewed Bento with a particular brand of venom. To her, he wasn't just a servant, he was a witness. He knew too much about her husband's private dealings, things she had been excluded from. She hated the way Bento carried himself, with a quiet dignity that her cruelty could never quite extinguish. Now that her husband was gone, she was ready to strip everything away from him, starting with his hope. The reading of the legal will had been a predictable affair. The lands, the house, and the remaining gold went to Perpetua. But the Colonel had left a second document, an emotional will, as the judge called it, specifically for the household staff. When the time came for Bento's inheritance, the room grew deathly quiet. Everyone expected a small sum of money or perhaps a modest piece of furniture. Instead, Perpetua had produced the burlap bag. "He wanted you to have this, Bento," she had said, her eyes gleaming with malice as she dumped the contents onto the floor. "The treasures of your master." A collective gasp went up from the prestigious guests. Out rolled mouldy pieces of parchment, their edges blackened by rot. Several rusted iron nails, thick and ugly, clattered across the floorboards. Finally, a handful of dried, blackened coffee husks spilled out, looking like the droppings of some ancient animal. It was a humiliating display, a public declaration that Bento's 40 years of service were worth less than the trash in a barn. The guests sneered, some covering their mouths to hide their laughter. "A fitting reward for a shadow," someone whispered. Perpetua stood over the pile, her chin held high, savoring the moment of Bento's total degradation. Bento knelt down to gather the scraps. His movements were slow, deliberate. As he reached for the mouldy parchment, a scent hit him. It wasn't just the smell of decay. It was a sharp, metallic odor mixed with the dampness of stone and the faint, lingering aroma of high-grade coffee beans that hadn't been processed in years. It was the scent of the old mill's basement, a place that had been boarded up for over a decade. His heart gave a sudden, violent thud against his ribs. He looked at the rusted nails. They weren't ordinary nails used for building. They were specifically forged markers, the kind used by surveyors to mark land boundaries deep in the forest. And the coffee husks. They were too large, too perfect, to be from the current harvest. "Thank you, mistress," Bento murmured, his voice thick with an emotion she mistook for shame. "Take your garbage and get out, Bento," she snapped, "and take that girl with you. I won't have your filth staining my parlor a moment longer." Bento gathered the bag and retreated, feeling the weight of 100 mocking eyes on his back. But as he stepped out onto the veranda and into the cooling afternoon air, he didn't feel humiliated. He felt a strange electric chill running down his spine. The Colonel was many things, a hard man, a flawed man. But he was never a fool. He wouldn't have left a bag of trash in a formal will just for a laugh. He was sending a message. But what could a few rusted nails and mouldy paper possibly mean in a world where the law was written by the masters? Bento didn't know yet, but he knew where he had to go. He found Tiana waiting for him near the great Jequitiba tree that stood in the center of the plantation. It was a massive tree, its roots reaching deep into the earth and its branches stretching toward the heavens like a silent prayer. It had been there long before the first coffee tree was planted, and it would likely be there long after they were all dust. For the people of the quarters, it was a symbol of endurance. "What did he leave you, father?" Tiana asked, her voice trembling as she saw the burlap bag. Bento sat down at the base of the tree, the giant roots forming a natural throne for his tired body. "He left me the truth, Tiana. I just have to figure out how to read it." He opened the bag and carefully laid out the items on a flat stone. The parchment was so fragile, it felt like it would turn to dust if he breathed too hard. Using his calloused fingers, he began to separate the layers. It wasn't one document, it was fragments of many. There were dates, names of neighboring farms, and numbers. Large numbers that didn't match the official records he had seen in the big house. "Look at this, Tiana," he whispered, pointing to a scrap of paper that had been tucked inside one of the blackened coffee husks. Tiana leaned in, her young eyes sharp. She hadn't been taught to read books, but she could read the patterns in lace and the subtle changes in the weather. She squinted at the faded ink. "That's a name, isn't it? It looks like Antonio." Bento froze. Antonio was the Colonel's younger brother, a man who had disappeared decades ago under mysterious circumstances. The family story was that he had died of a fever in the city, but Bento remembered things differently. He remembered a night of shouting, a horse galloping away in the dark, and a secret that had turned the Colonel's hair white overnight. "And this," Tiana said, picking up one of the rusted nails. "The head of the nail has a mark. It looks like a crown." Bento took the nail. His mind raced back to the old stories of the valley. The crown markers were used by the imperial government to designate the original borders of the land grants. If these nails were in the Colonel's private bag, it meant they weren't in the ground where they belonged. But this was just the beginning, Bento thought, a cold realization washing over him. If the boundaries had been moved, the entire map of the Fazenda Santa Sofia was a lie. The wealth Perpetua thought she owned was built on stolen earth, but he was just an old man in a burlap shirt. How could he possibly fight the widow, the judge, and the system that kept them all in chains? He looked at the mouldy parchment again, and that's when he saw it, a small circular seal at the bottom of a fragment. It was the seal of the local parish. "Tiana, your embroidery needle," Bento said, his voice urgent. "Give it to me." Confused, she handed him the small silver needle she kept tucked into her sleeve. Bento used the tip to carefully pry apart two pieces of parchment that had been stuck together by years of moisture and mold. As the papers separated, a small yellowish slip fell out. It was a baptismal record. Bento's eyes scanned the names, and his breath hitched in his throat. He felt as if the world had suddenly shifted on its axis. He looked at Tiana, then back at the paper, then back at Tiana. "Father, what is it?" "You're shaking," she said, reaching out to touch his arm. Bento couldn't speak. He couldn't tell her yet that the rotten scrap in his hand was the proof that her entire life was a lie, or rather, a secret that could save them all. The baptismal record didn't list a mother from the quarters. It listed a father, Antonio. Tiana wasn't just an orphan he had found. She was a legal heir to the bloodline of the masters. "We have to hide this," Bento whispered, his eyes darting toward the big house. "If Donna Perpetua finds out what is in this bag, we won't live to see the sunrise." And he was right to be afraid. High up in the big house, standing at the window of her bedroom, Donna Perpetua was watching them. She couldn't see the papers, but she saw the way Bento was hovering over that bag. She saw the tension in his shoulders. Her instinct, honed by years of protecting her status, told her that she had made a terrible mistake. She shouldn't have mocked him. She should have burned that bag the moment her husband died. She turned away from the window and pulled the bell cord. A moment later, the door opened and a large, shadow-like man stepped into the room. It was Saturnino, the overseer, a man whose whip had tasted the blood of every person on that plantation and whose loyalty was bought with gold and the promise of power. "Saturnino," Perpetua said, her voice like ice. "Bento has something of mine, a bag of trash my husband left him. I want it back, and I want him to understand that some secrets are meant to stay buried." Saturnino nodded, a cruel smile touching his lips. "And the girl, mistress?" "The girl is property," Perpetua said, turning back to the window. "And property can be sold. See to it that they are both ready for the auction blocks by the end of the week. But first, bring me that bag." The hunt had begun. Bento had the truth in his hands, but he was trapped in a cage of iron and debt. How could a man with nothing but rotten scraps face a woman who owned the world? He didn't know the answer yet, but as he looked at Tiana's needle, he realized that a single thread, if pulled correctly, could unravel the strongest of fabrics. But what he didn't know was that the colonel had left one more secret in that bag, something even Bento hadn't found yet, something that would turn the entire valley upside down, and that was only the start of the nightmare. Wait until you see what happens next, because the contents of that bag are about to trigger a war that no one at Fazenda Santa Sofia is prepared for. If you're as anxious as I am to see how this unfolds, leave your rating from 0 to 10 in the comments, and make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss the next part of this incredible journey. The truth is coming, and it won't be silenced. The shadows in the slave quarters of Fazenda Santa Sofia didn't just hide the weary bodies of the workers. They hid the weight of a secret that was now burning a hole in Bento's pocket. As the night deepened, the tropical rain began to lash against the mud walls, a rhythmic drumming that usually brought a sense of peace. But tonight every splash sounded like a footstep, and every creak of the timber sounded like the opening of a cell door. Bento sat on his straw mat, the small burlap bag clutched between his knees, his eyes fixed on the heavy wooden door that barely kept the world out. He knew that Donna Perpetua wouldn't wait long. She was a woman who smelled weakness, like a hound smells blood, and the moment she saw Bento's reaction in the parlor, she knew the trash her husband left behind was anything but worthless. Bento reached into the bag and pulled out the rusted nail again. In the dim light of a single tallow candle, the crown-shaped mark on its head seemed to glow with a sinister light. This wasn't just metal, it was a stolen boundary. It was the proof that the colonel had expanded his lands by moving the official markers under the cover of darkness decades ago. But that wasn't the most dangerous thing in the bag. Bento looked at Tiana, who was curled up in the corner, her fingers still clutching her embroidery hoop, even in her sleep. She was the scraps of a forgotten branch of the family tree. The baptismal record he had found, the one naming the colonel's brother Antonio as the father, changed everything. If that paper was real, Tiana wasn't a slave. She was a lady of the house, a legitimate heir to a fortune that Donna Perpetua was currently trying to sell off to pay her debts. "I have to hide this," Bento whispered to the empty room. "If they find this paper, they won't just sell her. They'll make sure she disappears forever. But where do you hide a piece of paper in a world where you own nothing? Where even your clothes are the property of another?" Bento's mind raced. He thought of the floorboards, but Saturnino knew all the hiding spots in the quarters. He thought of the thatched roof, but a single spark could turn it into an inferno. And that's when he looked at Tiana's embroidery. She had been working on a large white cloth, a centerpiece for the big house's dining table, adorned with intricate patterns of vines and flowers. It was her masterpiece. Bento picked up the cloth, his hands shaking. He carefully folded the baptismal record into a tiny, flat square and placed it behind a thick patch of embroidered lilies. With a needle and a thread of white silk, he began to sew. His stitches were clumsy compared to Tiana's, but in the dim light and under the cover of the existing patterns, the secret was swallowed by the fabric. "Sleep well, little heir," he murmured, his heart aching. "You are carrying your freedom on your lap, and you don't even know it." But there was no time for relief. Suddenly, the sound of the rain was pierced by the heavy, rhythmic thud of boots on the mud outside. Not the soft, barefoot steps of a fellow worker, but the heavy, iron-shod boots of the overseer. Bento froze. He quickly shoved the burlap bag under a pile of old rags and pulled a tattered blanket over himself, pretending to be asleep, just as the door was kicked open with a violence that shook the very foundations of the hut. Saturnino stood in the doorway, his massive frame blocking the light from the torches outside. Water dripped from his leather hat, and his eyes, cold and dark like the pits of the old mill, scanned the room. In his hand, he carried the long, braided whip that was the terror of Santa Sofia. "Wake up, old man," Saturnino growled, his voice a low rumble that vibrated in Bento's chest. "The mistress wants her property back." Bento sat up slowly, rubbing his eyes as if confused. "Master Saturnino, what property? The mistress gave me the bag in front of the judge. It was a gift." "The mistress says she made a mistake," Saturnino said, stepping into the room. The smell of wet leather and tobacco followed him, suffocating the small space. "She says there were items in that bag that belonged to the estate, private papers, gold markers. Give it to me, and maybe I won't have to use this on you tonight." He flicked the whip, and the crack was like a pistol shot in the small room. Tiana bolted upright, her eyes wide with terror. She instinctively grabbed her embroidery hoop, clutching it to her chest like a shield. I don't have anything of value, master," Bento said, his voice trembling. This time, he didn't have to act. "It was just trash, rags and rusted iron. I threw most of it away." Saturnino's eyes narrowed. He didn't believe a word of it. He began to toss the room, kicking over the small wooden stool, ripping the straw mats from the floor. He grabbed the pile of rags where the bag was hidden and shook them out. The burlap sack fell to the floor, and the rusted nails and blackened coffee husks spilled out. Saturnino picked up one of the nails, examining the crown mark. A slow, cruel smile spread across his face. This is exactly what she was looking for. But where are the papers, Bento? The mouldy parchments? "They fell apart in the rain, master," Bento lied, his heart hammering against his ribs. "They were rot, nothing but dust." Saturnino grabbed Bento by the collar, lifting the old man nearly off the ground. "Don't lie to me, you shadow. If I find out you've hidden so much as a scrap of paper, I'll make sure your death takes 3 days, and I'll start with the girl." He threw Bento back onto the mat and turned his gaze toward Tiana. She was trembling so hard the embroidery hoop was rattling in her hands. Saturnino stepped toward her, his hand reaching out for the cloth. "What's this?" he asked, his voice dripping with menace. "Is this where you've hidden it?" Bento's breath caught. His entire plan, Tiana's life, and the secret of the Santa Sofia were seconds away from being discovered. If Saturnino ripped that cloth apart, everything was over. "It's just my work, master," Tiana cried, her voice high and desperate. "It's for the mistress. If you soil it, she will have my head." Saturnino hesitated. He knew Donna Perpetua's temper. If he ruined the centerpiece she had been bragging about to the neighbors, his own position might be at risk. He glared at the cloth, then at Tiana's tear-streaked face. "Keep your rags, girl," he spat, snatching the burlap bag and the remaining nails. "But mark my words, the auction is in 3 days. You're both on the list, and I'll be the one to drive you to the blocks." As Saturnino disappeared into the rain, leaving the door swinging on its hinges, the silence that returned was even heavier than before. Bento crawled over to Tiana and pulled her into his arms. They were safe for now, but the clock was ticking. They had 3 days to turn a piece of hidden paper into a weapon of justice, but as Bento looked out into the dark, he realized that Saturnino wasn't the only one watching them. Deep in the shadows of the coffee groves, another figure was waiting. Someone who knew about the nails, the papers, and the secret buried in the embroidery. And this person wasn't working for the mistress. Before we find out who this mysterious figure is, I want to remind you to hit that subscribe button. We are entering the most intense part of Bento and Tiana's journey, and you won't want to miss a single second. Leave a comment below. Do you think Bento can keep the secret safe for 3 more days? Give us your rating from 0 to 10. Your engagement is what keeps these stories alive. The real battle for Fazenda Santa Sofia was just beginning, and the first casualty was about to be the widow's own peace of mind. Because while she thought she was selling off her debts, she was actually inviting her own destruction. And the key to it all was still clutched in Tiana's trembling hands. The morning sun rose over the Fazenda Santa Sofia not with warmth, but with a harsh, glaring light that seemed to expose every crack in the plantation's facade. The mist had cleared, leaving the red earth damp and the air heavy with the scent of wet coffee and desperation. For Bento, the ticking of the clock was now a physical weight in his chest. 3 days. In 72 hours, the auctioneer's hammer would fall, and the only family he had ever known would be scattered like seeds in a gale. But Bento wasn't finished. He knew that the paper sewn into Tiana's embroidery was a shield, but he needed a sword to go with it. He needed someone who knew the truth about the rusted nails Saturnino had stolen, someone who remembered the nights before the boundaries were moved and the bloodline was betrayed. He found old Lucia near the laundry stones, her back bent like a bow from decades of scrubbing the master's linens. Lucia was the oldest soul on the plantation. She had been there when the colonel was just a boy, and she had seen the rise and fall of 2 generations. She didn't look up as Bento approached, her hands continuing their rhythmic beating of a white sheet against the stone. "They took the bag, Lucia," Bento whispered, leaning over as if to help her with the heavy basket. "They took the shell, Bento. But did they find the pearl?" she asked, her voice like the rustle of dry leaves. "The pearl is safe, for now. But the overseer knows the nails are crown markers. He took them straight to the mistress." Lucia stopped her work, her clouded eyes finally meeting Bento's. "Then the war has truly begun. Those nails aren't just iron, Bento. They are the anchors of a lie. When the colonel moved them 30 years ago, he didn't just steal land from the neighboring estates. He stole the future of his own brother. Antonio knew. That's why he had to go." Bento felt a chill that the morning sun couldn't touch. "Is that why Tiana was brought to me? Because she was the evidence of Antonio's existence?" Lucia nodded slowly. "Antonio loved a woman from the village, a free woman of color. Their union was a threat to the colonel's total control of the inheritance. When Antonio disappeared, the woman died of a broken heart, leaving a child behind. The colonel brought that baby here thinking he could hide a wolf in a sheep's pen. He thought by making her a slave, he could erase her blood. But blood doesn't erase, Bento. It just waits." But that was only the beginning of the horror. Lucia leaned in closer, her breath smelling of bitter herbs. "There is a ledger, Bento. Not the one in the big house parlor, but a hidden one. The colonel kept it in the old mill basement, where the air is too damp for anyone to linger. It contains the true maps and the signed confession of the land fraud. That bag he left you at the mouldy scraps. They were the index. He was telling you where to look. The old mill. The very place where Saturnino often took the men for punishment. It was a place of shadows and pain, and now it was the only place that held the key to their salvation. "But I can't get in there, Lucia. Saturnino keeps the keys on his belt," Bento said, his voice sinking. "Then you must find another way," she replied, returning to her laundry. "Because the buyer is already here. I saw his carriage at the gate this morning. A man with a heart of stone from the southern mines. He doesn't want workers. He wants ghosts." Bento turned and saw it, a sleek black carriage parked in front of the big house. It looked like a hearse waiting for a body. Donna Perpetua was on the veranda, smiling and fanning herself as she spoke to a man in a tall silk hat. They were discussing prices. They were discussing lives. If you are feeling the tension of this race against time, don't forget to subscribe to the channel right now. We are approaching the moment where Bento has to risk everything. What would you do in his place? Leave your rating for the story so far from 0 to 10 in the comments below. Your support is what gives Bento the strength to keep fighting. Bento knew he couldn't wait for the cover of night. He needed to reach the old mill now, before the buyer and the mistress finalized the deal. But as he turned to leave the laundry area, a heavy hand clamped down on his shoulder. "Going somewhere, Shadow?" It was Saturnino. He wasn't carrying his whip this time. He was carrying a heavy iron chain. His eyes were bloodshot, and he looked like a man who hadn't slept. He leaned in close, his voice a venomous hiss. "The mistress wants you," and the girl moved to the holding pens by the gate. "No more quarters, no more embroidery. You're being sold as a pair to the man in the carriage. You leave at dawn tomorrow." The auction wasn't in 3 days anymore. Donna Perpetua had moved it up. She was terrified of what Bento knew, and she was clearing the board before he could make a move. "Please, Master Saturnino, let the girl finish her work for the mistress," Bento pleaded, his mind racing. "It's her final gift." "The mistress doesn't want gifts from a brat like that," Saturnino spat. "She wants her gone. Move." As Bento was led away in chains, he looked back at the big house. Tiana was being dragged from the quarters by 2 other guards, her embroidery hoop falling into the mud. The white cloth, the one containing the baptismal record, was trampled under the boots of the men. Bento's heart shattered. The secret was in the dirt, the time was gone, and the chains were tightening. But as he looked at the mud, he saw something Saturnino didn't. He saw the corner of the cloth being picked up by a small, nimble hand. It was the messenger, the mysterious figure from the shadows. And as the figure looked at Bento, he realized it wasn't a stranger at all. It was someone who had been waiting for this exact moment to strike. But who could possibly have the courage to defy Donna Perpetua and Saturnino at the same time? And is it too late to save the Fazenda Santa Sofia from its own rot? The answer lies in the basement of the old mill, but the path there is paved with more than just rusted nails. It's paved with the blood of those who came before. Stay with us, because the next turn in this story will change everything you think you know about justice. The iron bars of the holding pen were cold, smelling of rust and the blood of those who had occupied them before. Bento sat on the dirt floor, his back against the rough wood, watching the moonlight filter through the cracks in the roof. Beside him, Tiana was silent, her small hands empty of the embroidery that had been her solace for so long. The auction block was being constructed near the main gate. The sound of the hammers echoed through the night, like the ticking of a countdown. They had less than 6 hours before the sun would rise on their final day at Fazenda Santa Sofia. But Bento wasn't alone in the shadows. A soft whistle, like the call of a nightjar, drifted from the thicket of bushes just outside the pen. A young man stepped into the faint light, his clothes dusty from travel, but his eyes sharp with an intelligence that didn't belong to the plantation. In his hand, he clutched the white embroidery cloth, the one Saturnino had trampled into the mud. "Don't be afraid," the young man whispered, pressing his face to the wooden slats. "My name is Arnaldo. I'm a lawyer from the city. I've been tracking the colonel's debts for months, but I never expected to find this." He held up the cloth, pointing to the lilies where the baptismal record was hidden. "I saw the names, Bento. If this is real, this girl isn't property. She's the owner. Bento felt a surge of hope so strong it made him dizzy. It's real, Doctor, but a piece of paper won't stop the widow. She has the judge in her pocket and Saturnino at her side. You need more than a name. You need the proof of the theft. The land fraud, Arnaldo muttered, nodding. The neighboring estates have been complaining about shifted boundaries for years. If I can prove the colonel moved those crown markers, I can freeze the sale of the entire plantation. But I need the ledger, the real one. Bento gripped the iron bars. The old mill. Under the main water wheel, there is a stone with the mark of a cross. Beneath it lies a cellar that hasn't been opened since the year the brother disappeared. That's where he kept the truth. But Saturnino is guarding the path. You'll never get past him alone. Then I won't go alone, Arnaldo said, his voice firm. I have friends in the village, men who are tired of the widow's cruelty. We will get that ledger. But you must stay strong, Bento. When the sun rises, you must stand your ground. Don't let them put you on that wagon without a fight. Before we reach the moment where the hammers stop and the bidding begins, I need to know, do you think one young lawyer can stand against the power of a woman like Donna Perpetua? This is the moment where everything hangs by a single thread. If you're enjoying this battle for justice, please leave a comment with your rating from 0 to 10 and subscribe to the channel. Your support is the only thing that keeps these voices from being silenced. The hours that followed were a blur of tension and prayer. Bento watched the horizon, waiting for the first sliver of gold to break the dark. He could hear the distant shouts of men near the old mill, the sound of a struggle, and then silence. Had Arnaldo failed? Had the secrets of the mill been lost forever to the damp and the rot? As the dawn finally broke, the doors to the holding pen were thrown open. Saturnino stood there, his whip coiled around his arm, his face twisted in a triumphant sneer. Move out, shadows. The buyer is waiting, and the mistress wants her gold. Bento stood up, his legs shaking but his head held high. He looked at Tiana and saw a strength in her eyes he had never noticed before. She wasn't just a girl anymore. She was a legacy. As they were led toward the auction block, the town's elite began to gather, their carriages lining the road like crows on a fence. Donna Perpetua stood on the raised platform, her black mourning veil thrown back, a predatory smile on her lips. The auctioneer stepped forward, his voice booming over the crowd. First lot of the morning, a seasoned valet and a skilled seamstress. Do I hear an opening bid? The man from the southern mines stepped forward, his hand raised. But before he could utter a word, a voice cut through the air like a thunderclap. There will be no bidding today. The crowd parted as Dr. Arnaldo marched toward the platform, his clothes torn and his boots caked in the mud of the old mill. In his arms he carried a heavy, iron-bound book, the hidden ledger, and tucked into the crook of his arm was something even more powerful, the rusted nails with the crown markings. This land is under federal dispute, Arnaldo shouted, holding the ledger high for the judge and the guests to see. And these people are not for sale. Donna Perpetua's face went from white to a sickly purple. Guards, seize this madman, he's a thief. But Saturnino didn't move. He was looking at the ledger and then at the crowd of angry villagers who had emerged from the woods behind Arnaldo, armed with the very tools they used to build the mistress's empire. The tide was turning, and the rot of the Santa Sofia was finally being exposed to the light of day. But the widow had one last card to play, a secret that even the ledger couldn't reveal. And as she reached into her silk reticule, Bento realized that the final confrontation wouldn't be fought with laws, but with a truth that would shatter the family forever. The climax is here, and the fall of the big house is closer than you think. Stay tuned, because the next part is where the true inheritance is finally claimed. Donna Perpetua's hand trembled as she reached into her silk reticule, but it wasn't a document she pulled out. It was a small, silver-handled pistol, her eyes wild with the desperation of a cornered predator. The crowd gasped, retreating as she leveled the weapon at Dr. Arnaldo. "This ledger is a forgery!" she shrieked, her voice cracking under the weight of her crumbling world. "Bento stole those papers. He's a thief, and you are all fools." But Bento didn't flinch. He stepped in front of the young lawyer, his chest out, his gaze fixed on the woman who had spent years trying to break him. "You can't kill the truth with lead, mistress," he said, his voice echoing through the silent courtyard. "The colonel knew you would try this. He knew your greed would eventually outweigh your honor. That's why he left the trash to me." Arnaldo stepped to the side, opening the iron-bound ledger to a section that had been sealed with thick green wax. "It's all here, mistress," Arnaldo said, his voice cold and steady. The baptismal record isn't the only thing he hid. Behind the mouldy parchment in that burlap bag was a secret clause. He turned to the judge, who was now standing, his face a mask of shock. "Your Honor, the colonel filed a conditional manumission with the imperial court years ago. It states that if his wife ever attempted to sell a single soul from this plantation to settle his debts, the entire household would be granted immediate and irrevocable freedom." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the birds in the Jequitiba tree seemed to stop their singing. Perpetua's pistol clattered to the floorboards, her strength finally failing her. She looked at the guests, her neighbors, the elite of the valley, and saw only disgust. She wasn't the powerful widow of Santa Sofia anymore. She was a fraud who had tried to sell her own family's blood and defy her husband's dying wish. But the final blow was yet to come. Arnaldo pointed to the rusted nails on the table. "And because these markers prove the land was stolen from the crown, the estate is hereby seized by the government. You have nothing, Donna Perpetua. Not the land, not the gold, and certainly not these people." Saturnino, seeing the empire fall, tried to slip away into the coffee groves, but the villagers he had oppressed for years were already waiting. Justice wasn't just a word anymore, it was a physical force. The big house stood tall and white against the sun, but it was a hollow shell. Perpetua was left standing alone on the platform, surrounded by the ruins of her pride. We are reaching the final moments of this epic saga. If you felt the power of this revelation, please leave your rating from 0 to 10 in the comments and subscribe to the channel. The story isn't over yet. Wait until you see the new life that begins under the roots of the Jequitiba. The auction block was eventually torn down, its wood used not for chains but to build the first communal store of a new settlement. For the first time in 40 years, the air of the Paraíba Valley didn't taste of coffee and blood, but of a quiet, terrifying, and beautiful freedom. Bento and Tiana didn't seek the luxury of the big house. Instead, they used the recovered inheritance to establish a cooperative on the fringes of the valley. There, the coffee finally belonged to the hands that planted it. The story ends under the giant Jequitiba tree. Tiana sits in its shade, her embroidery needle moving with a grace that now reflects her soul's peace. She isn't sewing secrets anymore, but symbols of a future she chose for herself. Beside her sits the small burlap bag, once mocked as a container of trash, now filled with healthy, vibrant seeds ready for the next harvest. Bento watches the sunrise over the fields, finally understanding the colonel's final lesson. Truth, like a seed, can survive even in the middle of rot, and the most worthless things in the eyes of the cruel are often the most precious tools of justice. Dignity is a legacy that no master can truly take away, and justice has a way of blooming from the very scraps we are told to despise. Thank you for staying with me through this journey of shadows and light. If Bento and Tiana's victory moved you, please subscribe to the channel to support our work and ensure you never miss these emotional stories. Don't forget to leave your final rating from 0 to 10 in the comments. I truly want to know how this story touched you. Until next time.